Tonight, you are listening to true crime for sleep. There is no music here, no sudden changes in tone, no urgency, only a calm voice and a story told slowly, with care, so the night can remain gentle and uninterrupted. If you are able to, dim the lights around you. Let the room soften. Allow your body to settle into whatever position feels most comfortable. You do not need to focus closely on every detail. You can listen lightly, letting the story drift past you, the way distant sounds pass through a quiet street at night. The stories shared here are real. They are told with respect and without graphic description. There is no attempt to shock or disturb. This space exists for slow listening, for steady breathing, and for rest. Tonight's story takes us to Japan, and to a case that has remained quietly unresolved for more than 2 decades. It is known for the extraordinary amount of evidence left behind, for the careful and persistent work of investigators, and for the silence that has followed, despite years of effort. This is the story of the Miyazawa Family Murders. The case unfolded in a quiet residential part of Tokyo, at a time when the city was moving toward the end of the year, preparing for the calm and reflective period that often surrounds the new year. It was not a place associated with violent crime. It was a neighborhood shaped by routine, by nearby parks, by family life, and by the ordinary rhythm of people coming home at the end of the day. Unlike many stories told in true crime, this one is not driven by dramatic pursuits or sudden breakthroughs. It is shaped instead by methodical investigation, by forensic detail, by patient review, by a long commitment to understanding what happened inside a single home on a single night. Because this is a sleep-focused documentary, we will move carefully and slowly. We will stay close to confirmed facts. Where uncertainty exists, it will be named clearly and left where it belongs. Public theories and speculation will be kept separate from what investigators have officially established. This is not a story that asks you to solve anything. It does not ask you to form conclusions. It simply offers a quiet account of a case that continues to wait for answers. Take a slow breath in and let it out gently. Feel the weight of the day releasing from your shoulders. The outside world can continue without your attention for a while. There is nowhere you need to go, nothing you need to resolve. You can allow the details to arrive softly, without holding on to them. The Miyazawa case is often remembered because of what was found, because of how much was left behind, and because, even with all that information, the truth has not yet been fully reached. It reminds us that evidence does not always lead quickly to understanding. Sometimes it only deepens the quiet. As you listen tonight, you do not need to stay alert for every name or timeline. You can let the story flow gently, in and out of awareness, the way sleep begins to approach without being called. This is a story about a family, about a home, about a neighborhood that woke up to something it had never expected to hold, and about the slow, careful work that followed, year after year, without resolution, but never without care. As the night deepens, we begin at the edge of ordinary life, in a quiet part of a vast city, at a time of year meant for reflection. Before anyone knew how long the silence would last, Perugia has now faded behind us, and tonight's story opens in a very different setting. We begin in Tokyo, at the turn of the millennium, when the city stood quietly between 2 eras, carrying both the weight of long tradition and the quiet anticipation of a new century. At the end of the year 2000, Tokyo was already one of the largest and most complex cities in the world. It was dense, highly organized, and deeply structured by routine. Trains arrived on time, streets were carefully maintained, residential neighborhoods followed patterns shaped by decades of planning and community life. Even within a vast metropolitan area, daily life often remained local, contained within familiar streets, schools, shops, and parks. In many parts of the city, especially in family-oriented neighborhoods, evenings were calm. After the rush of commuting hours, Streets softened into quiet corridors of light and shadow. Small homes sat closely together, separated by narrow lanes rather than wide roads. The sound of traffic faded into the distance, replaced by the gentler rhythm of domestic life behind closed doors. Tokyo at that time was also a city shaped by safety and social order. Serious violent crime, particularly within residential areas, was rare. This did not mean that danger was impossible, but it did mean that people generally lived without the constant expectation of it. Parents allowed children to walk to nearby parks. Neighbors recognized one another. Daily movement followed predictable paths. This sense of quiet structure is important to understand. In many parts of the world, cities are associated with anonymity and constant motion. But in large areas of Tokyo, especially away from the busiest commercial districts, life moved at a slower and more familiar pace. Streets became extensions of the home. Public spaces were shared gently and respectfully. At the turn of the millennium, technology was beginning to reshape communication and work, but it had not yet transformed everyday life in the way it would later. Mobile phones existed, but they were not constant companions. Social media had not yet created continuous public visibility. People remained rooted in physical routines rather than digital ones. The period surrounding the new year carried particular cultural meaning in Japan. It was a time associated with reflection, family, and quiet transition. Many businesses closed temporarily. People returned home from work earlier than usual. The atmosphere became noticeably slower, more inward-looking, and more private. Within residential districts, this created a distinct stillness. Homes became central spaces. Families spent evenings together. The outside world felt distant, and the boundaries between public and private life became more clearly defined. Tokyo is often imagined as endlessly illuminated and restless, but for most residents, the city also offered something very different. It offered predictability. It offered routine. It offered the comfort of knowing what tomorrow would look like. This environment shaped expectations. It shaped the belief that home was a secure place, that family spaces were sheltered from the uncertainties of the wider city, that what happened beyond the door could be separated from what happened inside it. And in the small residential area where the Miyazawa family lived, this belief was deeply embedded into daily life. Their neighborhood was quiet. It bordered open green space. It was not part of the city's tourist image or business center. It was simply a place where families lived. At the turn of the millennium, nothing about this part of Tokyo suggested that it would become known beyond its local community. Nothing about the streets or houses carried the shadow of future tragedy. The rhythm of life continued as it always had, shaped by custom, routine, and the steady passage of ordinary days. It is within this calm, structured, and deeply familiar environment that our story begins. Not in a place of chaos, not in a place of unrest, but in a neighborhood defined by quiet order, shared space, and the quiet confidence that home was where the world remained safe. The Miyazawa family lived quietly within the rhythm of their neighborhood. Their home was not large or elaborate, but it was carefully kept and shaped around everyday family life. It stood close to a small park and residential walkways, part of a compact community where people passed one another often and recognized familiar faces. The family consisted of 2 parents and their 2 young children. Their lives followed patterns that were deeply ordinary. Workdays began early. School routines shaped mornings. Evenings were spent at home, resting, eating together, and preparing for the following day. Nothing about their household suggested isolation or instability. It reflected the steady structure common to many families living in similar parts of the city. The father worked in a professional role that required regular hours and predictable travel. His routine anchored the household, creating a consistent schedule that shaped the rhythm of family life. The mother focused on caring for the home and supporting the children's daily needs, managing school schedules, activities, and the quiet organization that keeps a household running smoothly. The children were young and closely connected to their parents. Their lives revolved around school, play, and time spent nearby in the surrounding park and residential spaces. The area offered a sense of safety that allowed families to move gently through daily life without constant concern. Children could play outdoors within sight of home, and neighbors were accustomed to seeing familiar families passing through the same paths each day. Inside the home, daily life was simple and consistent. Meals were prepared and shared. Clothing was laid out for the following morning. School items were gathered and placed ready for the next day. These small rituals rarely stand out in memory until they are suddenly interrupted. The house itself reflected long-term living rather than temporary occupation. Furniture was arranged for family use. Toys and personal belongings were part of shared spaces. The home carried the quiet accumulation of everyday moments rather than signs of transition or uncertainty. Importantly, there were no known conflicts or disturbances surrounding the family in the period leading up to the crime. They were not known to be involved in disputes. There were no reports of ongoing problems within the neighborhood. Their life was not defined by secrecy, tension, or disruption. Neighbors later described the family as ordinary and unremarkable in the most gentle sense of the word. They were known simply as people who lived nearby, a family who moved through the same streets, greeted others politely, and returned home at the end of the day without drawing attention to themselves. This kind of quiet presence often disappears into the background of community life. It is only when something goes wrong that familiarity becomes visible, when absence replaces routine, when a home that once held daily movement becomes still. At the end of December 2000, the family was approaching a period traditionally associated with rest and togetherness. The new year was close. Work and school schedules were slowing. Time at home carried a different pace, shaped more by family presence than obligation. Nothing in their daily life suggested that danger was approaching. Nothing pointed toward disruption. Their routines reflected continuity, stability, and a quiet confidence in the safety of their surroundings. It is from this deeply ordinary and carefully structured family life that the story unfolds. Not from conflict or secrecy, not from instability or fear, but from a home shaped by routine, connection, and the quiet expectations of another day to come. The Miyazawa family home was located in a quiet residential part of Setagaya, an area known for its balance between urban life and open, family-oriented spaces. Unlike the dense commercial districts that often define international images of Tokyo, this neighborhood felt contained and personal. Streets were narrow, gently curved, and designed more for local access than through traffic. People who walked there usually lived there. The house itself stood close to a small public park and green space. This detail would later become important for investigators, but in daily life it simply meant that the surrounding area felt open and calm. The park was used by families and children during the day, and in the evenings it became quiet, its pathways dimly lit and rarely busy. The Miyazawa home was a modest two-story residence built in the style common to many family houses in the area. It was not hidden or isolated. Neighboring homes stood nearby, separated only by narrow walkways and small boundaries. Sound could travel easily between properties, and movement on the street would normally be noticed by those nearby. This closeness created a subtle sense of shared awareness. People did not constantly observe one another, but the rhythm of the street was familiar. Residents recognized when something felt different. A car stopping late at night, voices in a place that was usually quiet, the absence of expected sounds in the morning. Inside, the layout of the house followed a practical and straightforward design. Rooms were arranged across 2 levels, with shared family spaces on the lower floor and private rooms above. The structure was typical for a family with young children, allowing everyday life to move easily between shared and private moments. The surrounding streets were lightly trafficked, especially at night. There were no major roads running immediately beside the house. Most vehicles passing through belonged to residents returning home. This reduced the background noise and made unusual activity easier to notice, even without direct observation. The park behind the house created a rare open boundary in an otherwise compact residential environment. It offered visibility and space, but it also created a quiet edge to the property. After dark, the park was largely empty. Footpaths ran through it, but they were not commonly used late at night, especially during the colder end of December. This combination of close neighbors on one side and open space on the other shaped the environment around the house. It was neither fully enclosed nor exposed. It sat gently between community and quiet, between familiar movement and stillness. From a security perspective, the home was not unusual. It did not stand behind heavy gates or fencing. Doors and windows reflected the everyday confidence of the neighborhood rather than heightened concern. Like most families living there, the Miyazawas relied on routine, familiarity, and social order rather than physical barriers. Importantly, nothing about the house suggested vulnerability in advance. It did not feel hidden. It did not feel remote. It did not feel separated from the life around it. It was simply part of a neighborhood designed for ordinary family living. When investigators later examined the location, they paid close attention to how easily someone could move around the property without drawing attention, and how the nearby park and walkways might have influenced movement before and after the crime. But before that night, these same features were simply part of daily life. Places where children played, where parents walked, where neighbors passed one another quietly. The house did not announce itself as a place where something extraordinary would occur. It blended gently into the street, into the park beside it, into the calm pattern of a residential area shaped around families, routine, and the quiet expectation that home was the safest place of all. The evening of December 30th, 2000, arrived quietly for the Miyazawa family. It was the final days of the year, a period when daily schedules in Japan often slow and families spend more time at home. The atmosphere in the neighborhood was subdued, shaped by the approaching new year and the stillness that usually accompanies it. What is known about that evening comes from careful reconstruction, rather than direct observation. There were no reported disturbances in the street, no calls to police, no neighbors later recalled unusual sounds or activity during the early part of the night. From the outside, the house remained part of the ordinary rhythm of the area. Inside the home, the family were together. The parents and their 2 young children were spending the evening in their usual environment, surrounded by the routines and familiarity of their own space. There is no evidence of visitors arriving that night, and no indication that the family had plans to leave the house later in the evening. Investigators later worked to establish the most reliable time frame possible for what followed. This process relied on confirmed data points rather than assumption. The time of death was estimated through forensic examination, but only within a range, not to a precise moment. No single minute could be fixed with certainty. What could be established was that the crime occurred during the late evening or early hours of the following morning. While the family were at home, the surrounding streets remained quiet during that period. The park beside the house offered no confirmed witnesses. The neighborhood itself did not provide a clear visual record of movement. There were no emergency calls from within the home. No neighbors later reported hearing voices, shouting, or prolonged noise. This absence of audible disturbance would later become one of the most unsettling features of the case. The events inside the house did not break through into the surrounding community. Because of the lack of eyewitness information, the night has remained defined primarily by physical evidence found later. Investigators were careful not to build narratives where none could be supported. They focused instead on what could be confirmed and what could not. It is also important to state clearly that, even after many years of examination, no confirmed sequence of actions inside the home has ever been publicly reconstructed in full detail. Authorities have never released a step-by-step account of what occurred that night. The absence of such an official reconstruction reflects both the limits of the available evidence and the caution applied to its interpretation. What can be said with certainty is simple and restrained. The family were alive that evening. They were in their home. Sometime during the night, an intruder entered the house and carried out the crime. The precise circumstances surrounding the entry, the exact timing, and the movement within the home have never been definitively established. This lack of clarity has shaped the entire investigation that followed. Unlike many cases where a timeline can be rebuilt through witnesses, messages, or surveillance, this night remains quiet and largely sealed from view. The house did not signal distress to the outside world. The street remained still. The park beside the home remained empty. From the perspective of the neighbourhood, December 30th ended in the same way most winter evenings there did, with lights dimming behind curtains, with doors closing softly, with families settling into rest. It was only later, when daylight returned and the home was approached again, that the weight of what had occurred during those quiet hours would finally become known. Until that moment, the night itself passed without leaving any visible mark on the world around it. The discovery of what had happened inside the Miyazawa home did not come from an alarm or a call for help during the night. It came quietly, through concern, when family members became worried after they were unable to reach anyone in the house. Relatives attempted to make contact by telephone. When no one answered, unease began to grow. This silence was unusual. The family were not known to disappear from communication without notice, especially during a period when people were typically at home for the new year. When a family member went to the house to check on them, the situation changed immediately. The stillness inside the home felt different from ordinary absence. Very quickly, it became clear that something was seriously wrong. Emergency services were contacted, and police arrived at the property without delay. From the first moments on scene, officers treated the house as a potential major crime location. Movement through the rooms was restricted, and the priority became preservation rather than interpretation. The home was secured and sealed. Entry and exit points were identified. Officers documented the condition of doors, windows, and interior spaces. Photographs were taken. Every detail was recorded carefully, not because conclusions had been reached, but because nothing could yet be ruled out. Specialist investigators were brought in shortly after. The scale and seriousness of what had been discovered required experienced forensic and homicide units. The focus shifted rapidly from welfare concern to full criminal investigation. The surrounding area was also examined. Streets, footpaths, and the nearby park were assessed for any signs of unusual movement or disturbance. Officers spoke quietly with neighbors, asking whether anyone had seen or heard anything out of the ordinary during the night. As with many residential investigations, responses from nearby residents were limited. No one reported clear noises or activity. There were no confirmed sightings connected to the house during the late evening or early morning hours. The neighborhood had remained largely unaware that anything had occurred. Inside the home, investigators began the slow process of documenting what had been left behind. This stage was not about building a story. It was about creating a precise and permanent record of the scene as it existed at the moment it was discovered. The response remained controlled and methodical. There were no public statements offering explanations. Police communication was minimal and cautious. The purpose at this stage was not reassurance or transparency, but accuracy. News of the incident spread quietly at first. The street was closed to unnecessary traffic. Officers remained visible but calm. There was no public spectacle. The seriousness of the situation was reflected in the quiet focus of those working at the scene. For the family's relatives, the transition from concern to confirmation was sudden and devastating. Their involvement with authorities became immediate and unavoidable. Questions were asked gently but thoroughly. Timelines were requested. Recent contact was reviewed. Every small detail became potentially important. The discovery marked the moment when an ordinary family home became a place of forensic examination and long-term investigation. What had once been private space was now part of an official record that would be reviewed and revisited for many years. The immediate police response did not produce answers. It created a foundation, a careful beginning, and the first quiet step into one of the most complex and persistent investigations in modern Japanese criminal history. When investigators began their detailed examination of the house, they approached the scene with unusual care. From the earliest hours, it was clear that the amount of material left behind was extensive. Unlike many cases in which evidence is limited or quickly disrupted, the Miyazawa home preserved a remarkable number of physical traces. The first priority was to document the condition of every room exactly as it had been found. Furniture, placement, doors, windows, and everyday household items were photographed and mapped. Nothing was moved without being recorded. The purpose of this work was not to interpret what had happened, but to protect the accuracy of the scene before time and human presence could alter it. What stood out to investigators almost immediately was that the intruder had remained inside the home for a significant period of time. This conclusion was not drawn from speculation, but from the volume and distribution of material left behind across multiple areas of the house. The scene did not reflect a brief or hurried presence. Personal belongings belonging to the family were still in place. The home did not appear to have been searched or emptied in a way associated with burglary. There was no clear indication that valuables had been taken. This absence of theft became an early and important observation for the investigation. Officers carefully identified locations where physical contact had occurred. Surfaces were tested. Clothing and household items were preserved. The purpose of this work was to determine what could be reliably linked to someone who did not belong to the family. One of the most unusual features of the case was the quantity of biological material recovered. In many investigations, usable material is limited or degraded. In this case, however, investigators were able to collect multiple samples from different areas of the home. These samples would later become central to the long-term direction of the case. The presence of this material allowed forensic teams to establish that the individual responsible had not simply passed through the home unnoticed. There had been sustained interaction with the environment. Doors, objects, and shared spaces had been used. Investigators also documented clothing and personal items believed to have been left behind by the offender. These items were treated with particular care. Their condition, placement, and composition were examined in detail. The goal was to learn as much as possible about the person who had worn or carried them, without introducing assumption. What made the scene especially complex was that it did not clearly indicate a single point of entry or exit. Several possibilities were considered based on the layout of the house and the surrounding area. Doors, windows, and access routes to the nearby park were all examined closely. Importantly, police did not publicly release many technical details about the precise nature of the evidence. This restraint was deliberate. In Japan, investigative authorities often limit the amount of scene information shared with the public in order to protect the integrity of ongoing inquiries and prevent false confessions or misleading tips. Despite the volume of material collected, investigators remained cautious. Evidence, even when plentiful, does not explain itself. Each item must be tested, compared, and interpreted within strict forensic standards. The existence of material alone does not guarantee identification. The house itself became a controlled forensic environment for an extended period. Specialists returned repeatedly to review samples, verify earlier findings, and confirm that no potentially useful detail had been overlooked. The scene was treated not as a moment in time, but as a long-term source of information. What also became clear was that the offender had not taken obvious steps to remove traces of presence. This did not lead investigators to assume recklessness or confidence. Instead, it simply became another unanswered element of the case. Motivation and behavior could not be reliably inferred from this fact alone. As days passed and laboratory work began, the importance of the physical evidence grew steadily. It represented the strongest and most objective link between the crime and the unknown individual responsible. In a case with no known witnesses and no confirmed suspects at that stage, material evidence carried extraordinary weight. Yet even with this unusual abundance, investigators understood the limits they faced. Forensic material can reveal identity only when it can be compared to something known, without a matching reference. Even the clearest sample remains anonymous. The Miyazawa crime scene became one of the most thoroughly examined domestic locations in Japanese criminal history. It offered investigators a rare opportunity to work with extensive physical data, but it also presented a quiet and deeply frustrating truth. The house could show that someone had been there. It could show how long they remained. It could show how closely they interacted with the space. What it could not show was who that person was. And it could not explain why the family had been chosen at all. The forensic work that followed focused increasingly on three closely connected elements: DNA, clothing, and a series of unusual traces left inside the house. Together, they formed one of the most distinctive and carefully studied bodies of physical evidence in any unsolved case in Japan. Investigators were able to recover biological material believed to belong to the person responsible for the crime. These samples were taken from multiple locations within the home and were preserved under strict laboratory conditions. The quantity and distribution of the material made it possible to establish that it did not originate from a single brief contact. Instead, it reflected sustained presence and repeated interaction with the interior of the house. From a scientific perspective, this was significant. In many domestic investigations, usable genetic material is either limited, contaminated, or degraded. In this case, forensic specialists were able to develop a reliable DNA profile that could later be compared against national and international databases. This created an enduring investigative pathway, one that could remain active for decades as technology advanced. Despite the strength of the DNA profile, no direct match was found in Japanese criminal records. This absence immediately raised an important possibility. The individual responsible may never have been previously registered in Japan's criminal DNA system, or may not have lived in the country long enough for such records to exist. Further analysis suggested that the genetic profile showed characteristics more commonly associated with mixed European and East Asian ancestry. Investigators were careful in how this information was communicated. Genetic indicators cannot determine identity. They can only suggest broad population patterns. Still, this detail influenced how later investigative strategies were shaped. Alongside the DNA evidence, clothing believed to belong to the offender was recovered from inside the home. These items were examined extensively. Fabric composition, manufacturing methods, and wear patterns were studied in detail. Even small elements, such as stitching, styles, and labels, were used to narrow possible points of origin. Some of the clothing appeared to have been manufactured outside Japan. This observation aligned with the genetic findings, but investigators were cautious not to treat correlation as confirmation. Clothing can travel easily across borders. People purchase items while abroad. Donated or resold clothing can move through many hands before reaching its final owner. The garments were also analyzed for traces of use, where patterns, damage, and residue were examined to better understand how long they may have been worn and in what conditions. These findings helped investigators distinguish between clothing that had been deliberately brought into the house and items that may have been part of the offender's ordinary daily wear. One of the most unusual aspects of the evidence was the presence of personal traces left behind that suggested the offender remained inside the home after the crime. This behavior was not interpreted as deliberate, taunting, or confidence. Investigators avoided psychological conclusions and instead treated it as a factual observation that required careful documentation. The house contained evidence that the intruder had used everyday household facilities and moved through multiple rooms without attempting to significantly conceal presence. This was confirmed through physical traces rather than assumption. Such behavior was highly atypical in domestic homicide investigations and contributed to the uniqueness of the case. Additional unusual traces were also documented, including small fragments and residues that were not immediately identifiable. These were preserved and later analyzed as technology improved. Some were eventually linked to everyday products and materials, while others remained inconclusive. Importantly, forensic teams resisted the temptation to overinterpret these details. Behavior at a crime scene can be influenced by countless variables, including panic, disorientation, physical condition, and unfamiliarity with the environment. Investigators avoided building personality profiles based solely on trace patterns. Over the years, the DNA and clothing evidence were repeatedly re-examined as scientific techniques evolved. New testing methods allowed for improved sensitivity, greater accuracy, and refined genetic interpretation. Each new review carried quiet hope that a connection might finally be made. International cooperation became part of this process. Information was shared with foreign law enforcement agencies, and databases outside Japan were consulted when possible. The aim was not to widen speculation, but to widen comparison. A DNA profile can only identify someone if it encounters a matching reference. Yet, even with these extraordinary resources, the identity of the offender remained unknown. The evidence itself never faded into irrelevance. It remained preserved, catalogued, and accessible to future investigation. Unlike memories, which weaken over time, physical data can grow stronger as scientific tools improve. In the Miyazawa case, DNA, clothing, and the unusual traces left behind did not solve the crime, but they did something equally important. They ensured that the person responsible could not disappear completely into silence. They left behind a clear and measurable presence, a presence that continues to wait patiently for a name. In the early stages of the investigation, police focused on establishing structure before pursuing individuals. This meant building a precise understanding of what could be confirmed about the family, the home, and the surrounding area, and only then allowing lines of inquiry to emerge naturally from the evidence itself. The first priority was to determine whether anyone known to the family could be linked to the crime. Relatives, neighbors, and people who had regular contact with the household were interviewed carefully and repeatedly. Schedules were reviewed, movements were cross-checked. Small, ordinary interactions were examined to see whether any unusual patterns had gone unnoticed at the time. This process did not reveal any clear personal conflict or unresolved dispute connected to the family. There were no confirmed reports of threats, arguments, or tensions that might explain why the Miyazawas would be targeted. For investigators, this absence of motive created an early challenge. Without a clear personal connection, the scope of inquiry widened quickly. Police then turned their attention outward, examining whether anyone had been seen in the area in the days and hours surrounding the crime. Officers canvassed the neighborhood repeatedly. Residents were asked about unfamiliar faces, unusual vehicles, or movement near the park and footpaths beside the house. These conversations were conducted quietly and methodically, without public pressure to identify a suspect. At the same time, Investigators examined known offenders in the wider region whose histories might be consistent with the type of crime that had occurred. This was done cautiously and without public disclosure. Being considered in this phase did not imply guilt. It reflected only that police were ensuring no relevant records were overlooked. Another early line of inquiry involved the possibility that the offender had no direct connection to the family at all. The evidence inside the house did not suggest familiarity with the victims. There was no indication that the intruder had been invited inside. This raised the difficult possibility that the crime may have been opportunistic rather than personal. The location of the house, particularly its proximity to the nearby park and public walkways, became part of this assessment. Investigators considered how easily someone unfamiliar with the neighbourhood could have approached the property without drawing attention. They also examined whether the surrounding environment could have offered both access and quiet escape. Importantly, police were careful not to treat early working theories as conclusions. Multiple possibilities were held at the same time. Each line of inquiry was pursued independently, allowing evidence to confirm or quietly close it. This approach prevented the investigation from narrowing prematurely around a single narrative. During this period, public communication remained minimal. Authorities avoided releasing operational detail about the evidence or their suspect considerations. This restraint was deliberate. It protected the integrity of the inquiry and reduced the risk of false leads being shaped by public speculation. As weeks passed, none of the early suspect lines produced a verified match to the DNA or other physical evidence recovered from the home. Interviews were completed, records were reviewed, potential connections were quietly ruled out. What remained was not a failure of investigation, but a narrowing of certainty. By the end of this early phase, investigators were left with a difficult but honest position. They had established what could not be supported. They had confirmed that no clear personal or local connection could be proven, and they had come to recognize that the person responsible may have existed entirely outside the family's ordinary world. The case would now need to rely less on familiarity and more on science, long-term data, and patient international comparison. The investigation moved forward without a name, but not without direction. As the early investigative lines within Japan narrowed, the focus of the case began to shift outward. The physical evidence recovered from the house, particularly the DNA profile and the clothing left behind, created a rare opportunity for long-term forensic comparison beyond national boundaries. Japanese investigators recognized early that the person responsible might not be represented in domestic criminal databases. The absence of a match within Japan did not weaken the evidence itself. It simply meant that the comparison pool needed to become broader and more carefully structured. Forensic specialists began working with international partners to explore whether the genetic profile could be compared against overseas databases within the limits of legal and privacy frameworks that vary between countries. This process was slow and heavily regulated. DNA data cannot be exchanged freely. Each comparison must be justified, approved, and conducted through formal channels. Rather than searching widely and informally, investigators approached the task with discipline. The aim was not to create a list of possibilities, but to establish whether the profile could be linked to any known offender records in cooperating systems. This approach required patience and often produced long periods without any visible development. Alongside genetic work, the clothing recovered from the house continued to receive detailed technical examination. Manufacturing features were analyzed repeatedly. Stitching patterns, textile composition, and construction methods were compared with known production standards from different regions. These examinations were intended to narrow the geographic origin of the garments, not to assign identity. Some findings suggested that certain items may not have been manufactured in Japan. This observation remained cautious and qualified. Clothing can be imported easily. Second-hand markets, international travel, and private resale make it difficult to trace garments to a single location with confidence. Investigators treated this information as directional rather than definitive. It helped inform international cooperation, but it was never used as a basis for public claims or suspect identification. Over time, the forensic strategy became increasingly shaped by technological progress. DNA analysis methods evolved significantly during the years following the crime. Techniques improved in sensitivity, resolution, and interpretive reliability. This allowed specialists to return to the original samples and re-examine them under improved laboratory conditions. These repeated analyses were not conducted because earlier work was considered flawed. They were conducted because scientific capability had advanced. The same preserved material could now be studied in ways that were not possible at the time of the original investigation. In several reviews, specialists were able to confirm and refine the original genetic profile, strengthening confidence in its reliability. The core conclusion remained consistent. The DNA belonged to a single individual who was not a member of the family. The profile remained suitable for comparison, even many years later. Long-term forensic preservation became one of the defining strengths of the case. Evidence was stored carefully and maintained for future use. Unlike many investigations, where early handling limits later opportunity, the Miyazawa case retained its scientific potential across decades. International inquiries were supported not only by forensic agencies, but also by immigration and customs record reviews. Investigators explored whether any individuals matching broad physical and travel patterns could be connected indirectly to the time frame of the crime. These reviews were conducted under strict legal oversight and without public exposure. Despite the scale of these efforts, no verified international match was identified. This absence did not end the forensic work. It redefined its purpose. The investigation shifted from searching for immediate identification to preparing for future opportunity. A DNA profile does not expire. It waits. It remains available for comparison whenever new data enters relevant systems. Investigators understood that the person responsible might only become identifiable if they were involved in another offense, submitted DNA voluntarily in another context, or became linked to genetic databases in ways that did not exist at the time of the original crime. This understanding shaped a long-term investigative posture rather than a short-term strategy. The case became one of readiness rather than pursuit. Throughout this period, Japanese authorities continued quiet cooperation with international forensic networks. New technologies were reviewed. Emerging comparison methods were evaluated. Standards were updated. Evidence remained protected and accessible. What is important to recognize is that this extended forensic effort was not symbolic. It was practical. It preserved the possibility of resolution without requiring public attention or dramatic developments. The case continued to move forward, even when nothing appeared to be happening. Long-term forensic investigation is rarely visible. It is composed of verification, storage, reanalysis, and waiting. It depends on systems rather than individuals, and on continuity rather than urgency. In the Miyazawa case, this slow and patient international focus became one of the most enduring elements of the investigation. The evidence remained alive, the science remained current, and the possibility of identification, however distant, remained open, not because investigators expected a sudden answer, but because they understood that sometimes the future is the only place where a comparison can finally be made. As the years passed and public interest in the Miyazawa case continued, a clear distance began to grow between what investigators could confirm and what wider discussion suggested. In a case that has remained unresolved for so long, this distinction becomes especially important. It protects the integrity of the investigation, and it prevents uncertainty from slowly turning into assumed truth. There are several facts that have never changed and have been formally established by police. The crime took place inside the family home in Setagaya during the night of December 30th, 2000. All 4 members of the family were present in the house at the time of the attack. An unknown individual entered the home and remained inside for a prolonged period. Extensive physical and biological evidence was recovered, including a DNA profile believed to belong to the person responsible. It has also been confirmed that no property of clear financial value was taken from the home. The scene did not show signs of organized theft, and investigators did not classify the crime as a burglary. This observation has remained consistent throughout the investigation. Another confirmed fact is that the DNA profile recovered from the house does not belong to any member of the family and has never been matched to an individual within Japanese criminal databases. Despite repeated forensic review and international comparison, no verified identification has been made. These elements form the stable foundation of the case. They are supported by physical evidence and official investigative findings. They do not change with interpretation, media coverage, or time. Beyond these facts, a much wider space exists where public theories have developed. Over the years, suggestions have circulated about possible motives, offender behavior, and personal background. Some of these theories have focused on the nearby park, the layout of the house, or the unusual amount of time the offender appears to have spent inside the home. Others have speculated about whether the crime was random or targeted. What is important to understand is that none of these ideas have been confirmed by police. They remain unproven interpretations drawn from incomplete information. Investigators have never publicly stated that the offender was known to the family, that the crime was planned in advance, or that it was connected to any broader criminal activity. Public discussion has also sometimes attempted to draw psychological conclusions about the person responsible based on behavior at the scene. These interpretations can be compelling, but they are not evidence. Behavior observed after a crime does not reliably reveal motive, background, or personality without independent confirmation. In this case, police have been particularly careful not to assign meaning where evidence does not support it. The fact that the offender remained inside the home after the attack is treated as an observation, not as proof of intent, confidence, or personal connection. The investigation has consistently avoided attaching narrative explanations to behavior that could be shaped by many unknown factors. It is also important to recognize what investigators have not claimed. They have not announced a suspect. They have not indicated that the offender belonged to any specific group or profession. They have not publicly identified a likely country of origin, even where forensic indicators suggest broad population patterns. These are treated as technical information rather than identity. In long-running cases, public theories often grow because silence feels uncomfortable. When no answers arrive, imagination fills the space that evidence cannot. Over time, repetition can cause speculation to appear reliable, simply because it has been heard often. The official position in the Miyazawa case has remained steady. Only information supported by forensic testing, verified timelines, and controlled investigative review is treated as fact. Everything else remains open, unconfirmed, and deliberately unresolved. This separation between fact and theory is not a weakness of the investigation. It is one of its strongest protections. It ensures that if new information ever appears, it will be evaluated without being forced to fit an existing narrative. In a case defined by extraordinary evidence but no identification, certainty must remain carefully limited. The truth, whatever it may ultimately become, will not emerge from discussion or assumption. It will emerge only from comparison, verification, and the quiet discipline of waiting. As the years passed, the Miyazawa case moved into a quieter phase, defined less by visible investigation and more by steady, institutional persistence. The absence of public updates did not reflect a lack of activity. It reflected a shift in how the case was managed once its early and most direct lines of inquiry had been exhausted. Within the Tokyo Metropolitan Police, the case remained formally open. Responsibility for review and oversight continued to be assigned to specialist units, rather than archived as a historical file. This ensured that the evidence, forensic data, and investigative records remained accessible and actively maintained. Periodically, the entire case file was reviewed again from the beginning. Timelines were re-examined, statements were reconsidered, physical evidence was rechecked against updated forensic standards. These internal reviews were conducted quietly, without public announcements, and were intended to identify whether any overlooked detail might take on new significance. Officers involved in long-term investigations understand that progress does not always come from new information. Sometimes it comes from reinterpreting old information in the light of technological or procedural change. This approach shaped the ongoing work surrounding the Miyazawa case. The role of silence became a defining feature of this phase. With no suspect to pursue publicly and no new evidence to announce, investigators avoided repeated media engagement. This restraint protected the integrity of the case and prevented false expectations from forming around speculative developments. At the same time, public memory of the case was quietly sustained. Annual commemorations and private remembrance ensured that the family and the circumstances of the crime were not forgotten. These moments were not investigative actions, but they played a role in preserving social awareness and public respect. Behind the scenes, cooperation with national and international forensic networks continued. As databases expanded and scientific tools improved, the preserved DNA profile and other physical traces were periodically reassessed. This long-term readiness remained one of the investigation's central strengths. The case also became part of internal professional learning. Without exposing sensitive details, the investigation was studied within law enforcement as an example of long-term forensic management and evidence preservation. Its complexity and unresolved status offered important lessons about patience and procedural discipline. For the officers who continued to carry responsibility for the case, persistence became less about urgency and more about stewardship. The goal was not to chase leads that did not exist, but to ensure that if a lead ever appeared, the case would be prepared to receive it. This form of commitment is rarely visible to the public. It exists in systems rather than individuals, in records rather than press conferences, in careful storage rather than dramatic movement. The Miyazawa case remained present within those systems. The evidence remained protected. The forensic potential remained intact. And the possibility of resolution, however distant, was never formally closed. Over time, the investigation became an example of how modern policing continues, even when answers do not arrive quickly. It demonstrated that unresolved does not mean abandoned, and that silence does not always mean stillness. Sometimes, silence is simply the sound of patience, and patience, in this case, has been sustained for more than 2 decades. For the relatives and loved ones of the Miyazawa family, time did not bring distance from what happened. It brought a different way of carrying it. The years that followed did not move the loss into the past. They folded it into everyday life, into memory, and into the quiet routines that continue even when something fundamental has been taken away. In cases like this, memory becomes both fragile and essential. It preserves the ordinary reality of the people at the center of the story, long after public attention has shifted toward evidence, forensic detail, and unanswered questions. The family are not remembered by those closest to them as part of a mystery. They are remembered as parents, as children, and as a household shaped by daily life, small habits, and shared moments. Public understanding of the case has always focused on what remains unknown. Yet for those who knew the family, what remains known carries greater weight. The way the children played nearby, the way evenings were spent at home, the quiet rhythm of a household that did not expect its life to become part of a national investigation. Memory also changes shape over time. Early grief is often loud and overwhelming. Later grief becomes quieter and more private. It settles into reflection rather than shock. It becomes something that exists alongside life rather than interrupting it. The absence of resolution creates its own emotional landscape. Without answers, families and communities are left without the language of closure. There is no moment that marks an end. There is only continuation. Days proceed, seasons return. The story remains open. In the wider community, the house itself became a quiet symbol of this unfinished state. A physical place that once held family life now carries the memory of what occurred within its walls. Over time, the neighbourhood has continued to live around it. New routines formed, streets filled again with ordinary movement. Life did not stop, even though one part of it remains unresolved. The memory of the family has also endured in quieter ways, not through constant media coverage, but through annual moments of remembrance, through private reflection, and through the careful preservation of their story as something more than a case number. An unfinished story does not mean an abandoned one. It means that the final chapter has not yet been written. It means that the space for truth remains open, even when no new information appears for long periods of time. In many unresolved cases, the hardest thing to accept is not the lack of explanation, but the lack of narrative ending. Human stories are usually shaped by beginnings and conclusions. This one exists in between. It continues without resolution, and it asks those who encounter it to accept uncertainty without replacing it with assumption. The Miyazawa family are remembered not because of the forensic detail that surrounds their case, but because of the ordinary life that preceded it. A home, to parents, to children, a household shaped by routine and care. Their story remains unfinished, not because it lacks importance, but because the truth that belongs to it has not yet found its way forward. As the night settles more deeply around you now, it is safe to let this story become quieter in your thoughts. You do not need to hold the details, the evidence, or the unanswered questions any longer. They can rest here, gently contained, without asking for your attention. If you are lying down, allow your body to soften into the surface beneath you. Let your shoulders drop. Let your breathing slow without effort. There is nothing you need to follow now. Nothing you need to solve. Stories like this remind us that not every ending arrives when we expect it to. Some stories remain open, not because they are incomplete in meaning, but because time has not yet delivered what is needed for understanding. The Miyazawa family's story is one of ordinary life quietly interrupted, and of a long, careful effort to restore truth without forcing it into shape. It is also a story of patience, of quiet work that continues even when no one is watching. You do not need to stay awake with this story. You do not need to carry it into tomorrow. It can remain here, in this quiet moment, and then slowly fade into the background of the night. Take a gentle breath in, and allow it to fall away. The room around you is still. The outside world has softened. Sounds are more distant now. Even the sense of time becomes less sharp as the night moves forward. If your mind drifts, let it drift. If images or thoughts appear, let them pass without engagement. They do not need your response. They can move through and dissolve, like light fading behind closed curtains. Let the sound of my voice become less important. You do not need to follow the words anymore. You can allow them to blur into a steady presence, something calm and neutral, like the rhythm of the city far away. There is no expectation placed on you now. There is no story left to finish. There is only rest. As you breathe, notice how your body knows how to settle without instruction. Muscles soften on their own. The jaw releases. The eyes grow heavier. You are allowed to let go. Thank you for spending this quiet time here, and for listening with patience and care. These stories are told slowly and gently, without music, without urgency, and without judgment, so the night can remain undisturbed. For now, allow everything to grow still. Let the room fade, let the thoughts slow, and allow sleep to arrive in its own time, quietly and safely. Good night.